What if the world you were taught to imagine before the Great Flood was never as simple as it seemed? What if the silence before written history is not emptiness, but absence? The kind left behind after something vast has been erased. In the dark spaces between clay tablets and broken stones, there lingers a feeling of loss, as though humanity once stood on higher ground, then forgot how it got there. Tonight we will move slowly through that mist together. This is an invitation, not a conclusion. A long descent into forgotten memory, here on Historic Sleep. And before you feel too comfortable, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Somewhere beneath the surface of history, something still waits to be remembered. Like a shoreline just before dawn, there is an unease that settles in when the earliest pages of history refuse to behave as expected. Not chaos, not confusion, but something more deliberate. As if the record itself is holding its breath. The story of civilization is usually told as a slow climb upward from mud and fire, yet the first surviving voices of Mesopotamia speak from a height already attained. They do not describe beginnings. They remember something that had already been lost. In the clay tablets of ancient Sumer, pressed with wedge-shaped marks and hardened by time, a list survives that has disturbed historians for more than a century. It is known simply as the Sumerian king list. At first glance, it reads like a formal genealogy of rulers, city by city, dynasty by dynasty. But then the numbers appear. Kings who ruled not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, said to have reigned for 28,800 years. Alilgar for 36,000. For 36. Names stacked upon impossibilities, calmly recorded, without commentary or apology. The list does not explain itself. It does not ask to be believed. It simply states. And then, without drama, it marks a division. Then the flood swept over. After this line, everything changes. Reigns shrink to human scale. Hundreds of years become decades. The tone remains administrative, almost indifferent, as though the scribes expected the reader to understand what had been erased. For a long time, modern scholarship treated these early reigns as mythological exaggeration, symbolic numbers, or theological flourishes meant to glorify the past. But this explanation leaves a residue of discomfort. Myth, when it appears elsewhere in Sumerian literature, announces itself clearly, wrapped in metaphor and divine spectacle. The king list does not. It behaves like a ledger. Cities are named. Succession is tracked. Power is transferred. And the impossible numbers are presented with the same confidence as the plausible ones. Even more unsettling is the fact that multiple versions of this list exist, found in different cities, copied across centuries. While they vary in detail, they agree on the central structure, a long era of kingship before a catastrophic flood, followed by a diminished world. This consistency suggests tradition, not invention, memory, not fantasy. If the pre-flood kings were purely symbolic, representing gods rather than humans, the text offers no clarification. The kings are not explicitly divine. They rule cities that archaeology confirms were real. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. These were not imagined places. They were settlements with temples, canals, workshops, and administrative systems already complex by the earliest layers we can excavate. The discomfort deepens when one considers the sophistication embedded in Sumerian culture itself. Writing does not emerge gradually in the archaeological record as a series of clumsy experiments. It appears suddenly, fully functional, capable of accounting, legal contracts, astronomy, hymns, and mathematics. The base 60 number system, still haunting our clocks and circles, arrives without a clear lineage of trial and error. It is as though the Sumerians were inheriting tools rather than inventing them. This pattern repeats across domains. Early Mesopotamian astronomy reveals careful observation of planetary cycles. Their calendars align lunar and solar rhythms with precision. Their architectural planning assumes advanced surveying knowledge. These are not the fingerprints of a culture taking its first steps. They look more like echoes. The king list read in this context begins to feel less absurd. The enormous reigns may not describe literal lifespans, but neither do they behave like careless exaggeration. Some researchers have noted that the numbers follow mathematical patterns, multiples of sacred units, suggesting encoding rather than error. Others proposed that these reigns measure epochs, houses or dynastic cycles compressed into personal names. Even so, the choice to preserve them, unchanged across centuries, implies reverence for an older truth whose full meaning had already faded. What, then, was the flood that divides the list so cleanly? In Sumerian literature, the flood is not metaphorical. It is a physical annihilation. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, itself drawn from older sources, the waters are sent to erase humanity, sparing only a single family warned in advance. This story predates the biblical account by centuries, and yet the parallels are unmistakable. The same catastrophe, refracted through different cultures, remembered rather than invented. Geology offers its own quiet corroborations. At several Mesopotamian sites, archaeologists have uncovered flood layers, thick deposits of silt separating older settlements from newer ones. These are not localized river overflows, but signs of widespread inundation. The dates do not perfectly align across regions, leaving room for debate, but the pattern is there. A break, a silence, a rebuilding. Mainstream chronology prefers to compress this rupture, to treat it as a regional disaster within an otherwise continuous ascent. But the king list resists this comfort. It insists on a before that does not fit neatly into our models, a time when kingship descended from heaven, not as poetry, but as a statement of origin. Authority did not arise organically, it was transferred. There is also the matter of what happens after the flood. Civilization resumes quickly. Cities are rebuilt. Writing continues. Laws are codified. If humanity had truly been reduced to scattered survivors with no memory, this recovery would have taken far longer. Instead, it feels like a restoration, guided by fragments that survived the deluge. Some scholars suggest that the king list served a political purpose, legitimizing later dynasties by anchoring them to an impossibly ancient past. But even propaganda must work with existing beliefs. The list could only persuade if its audience already accepted the idea of a lost age, a greater time before disaster. What lingers is not proof but tension. A sense that the earliest historical document we possess is already looking backward, already aware of a fall. The Sumerians did not see themselves as pioneers at the dawn of time. They saw themselves as heirs, and heirs, by definition, inherit ruins as well as treasures. The king list may not tell us exactly who ruled before the flood, or how. But it refuses to let that era vanish completely. It leaves a seam in history, barely stitched, inviting pressure. What other memories were compressed into myth because there was no longer language precise enough to hold them? The list ends, but the division it introduces does not. It remains a fault line running beneath every timeline we construct, whispering that history did not begin where we prefer to start counting. Something older stands behind the first kings we can name, waiting in the long shadow cast by the flood. The discomfort left by the Sumerian king list does not fade when the tablet ends. It deepens when attention shifts from what was written to how it was written. The marks pressed into clay are not merely symbols of speech, they are measurements, ratios, cycles. They speak in a language that is mathematical long before it is poetic, and this is where the sense of inheritance becomes harder to dismiss. Cuneiform did not begin as storytelling. Its earliest uses were accounting records, tallies of grain, livestock, labour, land. Yet the system that emerges is already capable of abstraction. Quantities are expressed through a sexagesimal structure, a base 60 system so refined that it still governs how modern humans divide time and space. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees. This is not a convenient coincidence. Base 60 is mathematically demanding, chosen not for simplicity, but for flexibility, because it divides cleanly into many fractions. It is a system designed by people who understood division deeply. There is no archaeological trail showing how Sumerians arrived at this system through gradual experimentation. No discarded base 10 tablets, no competing models slowly abandoned. The earliest numerical texts already assume the reader understands complex place values and shifting meanings depending on context. A single symbol can represent different magnitudes depending on its position. This requires shared conventions, teaching traditions, and time. It suggests continuity reaching backward beyond the visible horizon of excavation. Embedded within these numbers are traces of cosmology. Astronomical texts from Mesopotamia describe cycles of Venus with uncanny accuracy, tracking its appearances and disappearances over periods that require decades of observation. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, though copied later, preserves data that aligns closely with real celestial movements. Such precision implies long-term record-keeping, likely inherited from earlier observers whose original logs are lost. The Sumerians did not frame this knowledge as discovery. They framed it as restoration. In their myths, wisdom is not invented, but retrieved. Sacred plans for temples are said to descend from the heavens. Kings do not legislate arbitrarily, they receive laws. Even crafts are described as gifts from divine figures who arrive already knowing how things are done. These narratives blur the line between metaphor and memory, but they maintain a consistent direction of flow. Knowledge moves downward, not upward. This pattern becomes more intriguing when examining units of measurement. The cubit, the IQ of land, standardized weights and volumes appear early and remain stable for centuries. Standardization requires authority and agreement across regions. It also requires an origin point accepted as correct. In a fragmented, experimental society, such uniformity is unlikely. In a recovering civilization, attempting to preserve what it remembers, it makes more sense. Some scholars have argued that the extreme numbers associated with pre-flood kings encode astronomical cycles, multiples of 60, 360, and larger composite units appear repeatedly. When viewed through this lens, the reigns become less about individual rulers and more about the duration of cosmic ages. Kingship, in this sense, becomes a marker for time itself. The king does not rule history, he embodies it. If this interpretation holds even partially true, then the king list is not absurd at all. It is a compressed archive, preserving large-scale temporal knowledge in a form that survived oral collapse. Names anchor numbers. Stories stabilize data. Myth becomes a vessel for measurement when direct explanation is no longer possible. The flood, then, is not only a physical catastrophe but a cognitive one. It breaks continuity of explanation. Survivors inherit fragments without full context. They repeat formulas whose origins they no longer fully grasp. Over generations, the meaning thins, but the structure remains. This is how ancient knowledge hides in plain sight, mistaken for superstition because its original frame of reference has vanished. There is also the matter of silence. Between the supposed invention of writing and the earliest tablets we possess, there is a gap that should be crowded with failures. Instead, there is nothing. Writing appears abruptly, already standardized across regions. This suggests that earlier experiments, if they existed, did not survive the flood, or whatever sequence of disasters it represents. What remains is not the beginning, but the reboot. Even the Sumerian language itself raises questions. It is a linguistic isolate, unrelated to surrounding tongues. It arrives without clear ancestors and later disappears, replaced by Akkadian, yet continues to be used as a sacred and scholarly language for centuries, much like Latin. This reverence implies age, authority, and a belief that Sumerian carried something older and purer than everyday speech. When later civilizations inherited Mesopotamian knowledge, they treated it as ancient even then. Babylonian scribes copied Sumerian texts they could barely translate, preserving them verbatim. This is not how new civilizations treat recent innovations. It is how they treat relics. The idea that early humanity was primitive sits uneasily beside this evidence. What appears instead is a culture standing amid ruins, carefully gathering what survived. They measure, they count. They align temples with stars whose names they did not invent. They tell stories about gods not to entertain, but to remember who taught them how to rebuild. None of this requires imagining technologies beyond what is documented. It requires only accepting that sophistication does not always move in one direction. Progress can collapse. Memory can fracture. A civilization can inherit advanced concepts without remembering their source. The numbers carved into Sumerian clay do not shout their secrets. They whisper through repetition, through structure, through stubborn consistency. They ask to be read slowly, not as myths of ignorance, but as fossils of thought. And like all fossils, they imply a living world that once moved freely before it was buried. What remains uncertain is not whether something was lost, but how much. The mathematics survived. The language survived. The cities rose again. But whatever once connected these systems into a unified understanding did not. It slipped beneath the floodwaters of time, leaving behind fragments that still align too well to be accidental, yet too incomplete to fully explain themselves. What follows the encoded numbers and inherited systems is a pattern that feels less like growth and more like recovery. The flood, as preserved in Sumerian memory, functions not as an origin point, but as a dividing wall. On one side, time stretches unnaturally long. Kingship descends and order appears already established. On the other, everything feels smaller, compressed and urgent, as if humanity is working against a fading recollection. In the Sumerian worldview, the flood is not described as the birth of civilization, it is described as its interruption. When the waters recede, cities are not invented from nothing. They are rebuilt. Names return. Eridu, Uruk, Kish, Lagash. These are not presented as new foundations, but as restorations of places that already mattered. The gods themselves return to familiar temples, as though following a map older than the disaster. This detail matters because mythological beginnings usually celebrate novelty. They describe first fires, first tools, first laws. The Sumerian flood tradition does not. It carries grief instead. Laments speak of cities abandoned, shrines silenced, order drowned. The emotional tone is not triumph, but loss. Civilization does not emerge with joy, but limps back into existence. Archaeology quietly mirrors this mood. At sites like Shurapak and flood deposits separate occupational layers. Below the silt, organized settlements already existed. Above it, life resumes with familiar layouts, similar technologies and inherited practices. Pottery styles continue. Administrative systems return. This continuity suggests survivors who remembered how things were done, not children inventing from scratch. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves one of the clearest expressions of this memory. Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, is not portrayed as ignorant or primitive. He understands construction, measurement, sealing techniques, and logistics. He builds a vessel according to precise dimensions, not divine improvisation. After the flood, he does not teach humanity how to live. He withdraws, carrying with him knowledge that will not fully re-enter the world. This withdrawal is important. It introduces the idea that some knowledge survived but became inaccessible. The survivor is removed from history, placed beyond reach, immortal yet absent. Humanity continues without him, guided only by fragments. This narrative choice suggests an awareness that something essential was lost, even though life continued. In later Mesopotamian texts, wisdom is increasingly institutionalized. It moves into priesthoods, scribal schools, temple archives. Knowledge becomes guarded, specialized, separated from daily life. This is not how a newly invented civilization behaves. It is how a civilization behaves when it fears losing what little remains. The laws of Ur-Nammu and later Hammurabi do not present themselves as innovations. They are restorations of cosmic order. Justice is framed as alignment with an older balance, disturbed by chaos. Kings are caretakers, not creators. Their legitimacy depends on preserving stability, not pushing boundaries. This mindset aligns with a post-catastrophe culture. When survival is uncertain, preservation becomes sacred. Experimentation becomes dangerous. The past becomes authoritative because it represents a time before the break. Even when progress occurs, it is framed as recovery of what was already known. The flood also functions as a reset in scale. Before it, reigns stretch beyond comprehension. After it, time contracts. Human lifespans shorten in parallel myths. Ambition narrows. The world becomes heavier, slower. This shrinking is not only biological or symbolic, it reflects a collapse in capacity. Fewer resources, less coordination, smaller horizons. Comparative mythology reinforces this interpretation. Flood traditions across cultures often include culture heroes who teach agriculture, writing, or law after the waters recede. These figures are rarely inventors. They are bearers. They arrive knowing, not discovering. The knowledge they bring is complete, not experimental, and it often fades after a few generations. This pattern suggests that ancient societies understood catastrophe as a filter. Not everything passes through. What survives does so unevenly. Techniques may remain while theory disappears. Ritual may persist while explanation vanishes. Over time, form remains but meaning erodes. Mainstream history tends to flatten this complexity. It treats the flood as either pure myth or as a localized event with limited impact. But the internal logic of the text argues otherwise. The flood is central. It reorganizes time, authority, and memory. It explains why the oldest records already feel old. There is also the psychological dimension. A civilization that remembers annihilation carries caution in its bones. This may explain the intense concern with omens, divination, and celestial signs in Mesopotamia. The sky becomes a warning system. The gods communicate through eclipses and planetary motions. Disaster is expected to return. Such vigilance implies experience, not imagination. Fear learned through myth feels different from fear learned through survival. The latter embeds itself deeply, shaping institutions and priorities. The careful observation of nature, the obsession with cycles, the desire to predict chaos, all align with a society that has seen order fail completely. The flood, then, is not a convenient myth to explain ignorance. It is a memory scaffold, holding together fragments of a deeper past. It justifies why knowledge feels inherited yet incomplete. It explains why early civilizations appear suddenly capable, yet culturally anxious. What remains unsettling is how comfortably this interpretation fits the evidence without requiring impossible technology or fantasy. It only requires accepting that history is not a straight line. That collapse can erase context while leaving artifacts intact. That humanity can forget more than it remembers. The flood does not sit at the beginning of civilization. It stands in the middle, a scar running through time. Everything before it appears larger, quieter, and strangely confident. Everything after it feels cautious, meticulous, and haunted. Between the two lies a silence that no tablet fully explains, but which every line seems to acknowledge. That silence is not empty, it is dense with absence, carrying the weight of what did not survive the reset, and shaping everything that followed in ways we are only beginning to notice. Once the idea of a civilizational reset is allowed to settle, the question quietly shifts from what was destroyed to what endured. The surviving record does not feel random. Certain forms of knowledge pass through the catastrophe with remarkable clarity, while others vanish almost completely. This selective survival hints at intentional transmission, as though someone, somewhere, chose what was worth carrying forward. In Sumerian tradition, this role belongs to the Apkallu, the sages who existed before the flood. They are described as semi-divine beings, advisors to kings, masters of ritual, architecture, writing, and law. Their names are preserved. Their functions are defined. They are not chaotic tricksters or distant gods, but educators. After the flood, their influence changes. They no longer walk openly among humans. Instead, their knowledge is sealed into texts, symbols, and lineages. Later Mesopotamian scholars treated the Apkallu as historical figures whose wisdom had to be reconstructed. Lists of sages appear alongside lists of kings, mirroring the structure of political authority with intellectual authority. This parallel suggests that knowledge itself was once centralized and personal, passed directly from teacher to ruler before becoming institutionalized. What makes the Apkallu compelling is not their mythological framing, but the specificity of what they are said to have taught. Temple design, city planning, writing, sacred rites aligned with cosmic order. These are foundational systems, not incremental skills. They are the kinds of things one would want to preserve if starting over under constrained conditions. After the flood, the Apkallu do not disappear entirely, they transform. Some traditions describe them as taking human form, becoming mortal, marrying, and passing knowledge through bloodlines. Others suggest their teachings were encoded into rituals and symbols to survive future disruptions. In either case, the implication remains the same. The continuity of civilization depended on deliberate transmission. This pattern is echoed in the figure of Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood survivor. He is granted immortality, but removed from the world. He becomes a living archive that cannot be accessed. Humanity must rebuild without direct guidance, relying instead on inherited fragments. The presence of an unreachable source reinforces the sense of loss, making what remains feel incomplete by design. The idea of culture bearers appears globally. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl brings knowledge and withdraws. In Egypt, Thoth delivers writing and measurement. In India, the rishis receive eternal truths and transmit them orally. These figures are not inventors, but messengers. Their role is preservation, not creation. The recurrence of this motif suggests a shared understanding of civilizational inheritance following catastrophe. Critics often dismiss these parallels as universal storytelling patterns, but the consistency of function deserves attention. The teachers always arrive already knowing. They appear at moments of rebuilding. They leave behind systems that are too cohesive to be improvised. This does not prove a single global source, but it does point toward a common response to loss. In Mesopotamia, the transition from personal sages to institutional knowledge marks a turning point. Writing becomes sacred. Scribal schools enforce strict copying rules. Errors are feared. Texts are preserved verbatim, even when their language becomes obsolete. This obsession with accuracy is unusual in young cultures, but common in those preserving relics. The priesthood becomes the guardian of memory. Ritual replaces explanation. Symbols replace direct teaching. Over time, meaning becomes layered, requiring initiation to interpret. This protects knowledge but also distances it from everyday life. What was once practical becomes ceremonial. This process also introduces hierarchy. Access to knowledge becomes power. Those who control the texts control legitimacy. Kings rule by claiming alignment with ancient wisdom, not by innovation. Stability is valued above progress. The past becomes the ultimate authority, even when it can no longer be fully understood. The risk of this system is stagnation, but the greater risk is forgetting. Without renewal, symbols become empty. Ritual becomes performance. The original intent dissolves. Yet the structure persists, fossilized, because it still carries social weight. Archaeological remains reflect this tension. Temples grow more elaborate, but their orientations continue to follow ancient celestial alignments. Measurements remain consistent, even as craftsmanship fluctuates. It is as though the blueprint is preserved while the builders struggle to match it. The idea that advanced ancestors transmitted knowledge to later societies does not require imagining lost machines or forbidden technologies. It requires acknowledging that intellectual complexity can survive collapse more easily than infrastructure. Ideas are lighter than stone. They can be carried, memorized, ritualized. What may have been lost are the systems that integrated these ideas into a unified worldview. The survivors knew how to build, but not why it worked. They knew how to count, but not where the system came from. Over generations, confidence gave way to reverence, and reverence to dogma. This shift creates the illusion of primitivism. Later observers see ritual without context and assume ignorance. They see myth and assume fantasy. But myth often begins as compression, not invention. It is what remains when explanation becomes too long, too complex, or too dangerous to preserve openly. The Apkallu stand at the threshold between memory and myth. Whether they were historical figures, symbolic representations of knowledge lineages, or a blend of both, their function is clear. They mark a time when wisdom was closer, more direct, less mediated. After them, humanity navigates by echoes. The systems work, but the understanding's partial. Civilization moves forward, but always with its head turned slightly backward, listening for instructions that no longer arrive. This leaves an uncomfortable implication. If knowledge once had guardians who withdrew or vanished, then what we call progress may be movement without orientation. We continue building on foundations whose original purpose we no longer remember, trusting that repetition alone will keep the structure standing. The silence left by the teachers is not accidental. It defines the post-flood world. And within that silence, history continues, shaped not only by what survived, but by who decided how it would be remembered. As the post-flood world settles into its inherited routines, one domain stands out for its quiet precision: the sky. While cities were rebuilt and institutions reshaped, the heavens remained unchanged, offering a stable reference point amid terrestrial uncertainty. What emerges from early Mesopotamian astronomy is not the tentative curiosity of beginners, but the disciplined attention of observers, continuing a much older practice. The Sumerians and their successors did not merely watch the stars for poetic inspiration. They catalogued them. Constellations were named and grouped. Planetary movements were tracked with patience that spanned generations. The heavens were divided into paths, stations, and cycles, each associated with specific deities and omens. This was not stargazing, it was administration. Astronomical knowledge appears in the earliest texts already structured. The sky is divided into 3 paths, associated with Enlil, Anu, and Ea. Each path governs specific regions of the celestial sphere. This tripartite division is not intuitive. It reflects an abstract ordering imposed on observation, requiring long-term data collection and theoretical framing. Such systems do not arise overnight. The Babylonian MUL.APIN tablets, though compiled later, preserve much older star lists and observational traditions. They describe the heliacal risings and settings of stars with remarkable accuracy. Some of these observations require stable recording over centuries to notice subtle patterns. The data implies a continuity of observation that extends well before the tablets themselves were written. Venus, in particular, held special importance. Its erratic cycle, alternating between morning and evening star, was tracked meticulously. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa records its appearances and disappearances over a 21-year cycle with precision that modern astronomers can verify. This level of accuracy suggests observers who were not only patient, but methodical, inheriting techniques refined over time. What makes this unsettling is how early this precision appears. There is no visible learning curve, no gradual refinement from rough estimates to exact predictions. The system arrives already confident. Errors exist, but they are minor, not foundational. It feels like a discipline resumed, not invented. Astronomy was inseparable from timekeeping. Calendars synchronized lunar months with the solar year through intercalation, a complex process requiring foresight and adjustment. This balancing act was essential for agriculture, ritual, and governance. Mistakes would have had cascading consequences. The fact that these systems worked reliably suggests deep familiarity rather than experimental risk. The sky also functioned as a memory archive. Celestial cycles outlast human generations. By encoding time into the heavens, ancient observers anchored history to something that could not be destroyed by floods or fires. Even if records were lost, the patterns remained. This may explain why astronomy became a sacred science, protected and ritualized. In omen literature, celestial events are treated as messages. Eclipses, conjunctions, and unusual movements are interpreted as warnings or confirmations. While modern readers often dismiss this as superstition, it reflects a worldview shaped by catastrophe. If disaster had once arrived without warning, the sky became the place to watch for signs of its return. This vigilance is not irrational, it is learned behaviour. A culture that has experienced sudden annihilation would naturally seek predictability wherever it could find it. The heavens offered that stability. Their cycles were reliable, their deviations noticeable. Over time, meaning layered itself onto observation, blending science with ritual. The consistency of astronomical knowledge across Mesopotamian cultures suggests inheritance rather than isolated discovery. Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian traditions align closely, even as languages and political powers change. The sky remains the same reference point, immune to cultural resets. Similar patterns appear elsewhere. Ancient Egyptian calendars, Chinese star records, and Mesoamerican astronomical systems all demonstrate early sophistication. While independent development is possible, the shared emphasis on cycles, precision, and long-term observation hints at a common response to loss, anchoring knowledge to what endures. The question is not whether ancient people could observe the sky, it is whether they did so continuously across deep time. The evidence suggests they did, but the beginning of that continuity lies beyond the visible record, possibly erased by the same forces that necessitated its preservation. Astronomy, unlike architecture or writing, survives collapse more easily. It requires no tools beyond the human eye and memory. It can be taught orally. It can be encoded in myth. Constellations become stories. Cycles become gods. In this way, data survives disguised as narrative. When later scholars inherited these systems, they treated them as ancient even in their own time. Texts were copied with reverence. Errors were corrected by comparison to older sources. Authority flowed backward. The past knew more than the present. This inversion challenges modern assumptions. We expect knowledge to accumulate. We expect the present to outperform the past. But the sky does not care about progress. It repeats. Those who observe it long enough begin to understand patterns that those focused only on novelty may miss. The astronomical systems of Mesopotamia feel like the remnants of a longer conversation between humanity and the heavens, interrupted but not silenced by catastrophe. Tied by they carry the calm confidence of something tested many times before. What remains uncertain is how much of this knowledge was once integrated with other disciplines now fragmented. Astronomy survives clearly because the sky remained accessible. Other systems may have depended on contexts that did not. The stars continue their cycles whether watched or not. But the way early civilizations watched them suggests more than curiosity. It suggests memory. A deliberate act of continuity in a world that had already learned how easily continuity could be broken. In the quiet regularity of ancient star lists, there is a refusal to forget, a promise that even if the earth is remade, the sky will remember what humanity once knew how to see. While the sky preserved memory through cycles, the earth preserved it through stone. Architecture and geometry offer a different kind of testimony, one grounded in weight, alignment, and proportion. When examined closely, early monumental construction does not resemble the hesitant experiments of a young civilization. It looks like the continuation of a language already spoken fluently. In Mesopotamia, the earliest temples were not crude shelters evolving slowly toward complexity. They appear suddenly as deliberate forms. Platforms were leveled with care, corners aligned to cardinal directions. Measurements were standardized. The ziggurat, often treated as a symbolic mountain, is also an exercise in precise engineering. Its terraces require load calculations, material planning, and long-term maintenance strategies. These structures were not improvised. The city of Eridu, often described as one of the oldest urban centers, reveals multiple layers of temple construction built one atop another. Each new temple respects the orientation and footprint of the previous one, as though preserving an inherited design. This continuity implies a blueprint older than any single generation. Builders were not free to innovate arbitrarily. They were restoring something remembered. Surveying knowledge appears early and confidently. Land was measured, divided, taxed. Canals were planned across flat terrain with subtle gradients to ensure water flow without erosion. Such systems require an understanding of geometry and hydrology that is not intuitive. Mistakes would have been catastrophic. Yet these systems functioned. The tools available were simple. The results were not. This gap suggests mastery of principles rather than reliance on technology. Geometry, once understood, does not require advanced instruments. It requires transmission. Someone must teach how to think in angles, ratios, and abstractions. The persistence of specific proportions across regions is telling. Rectangular layouts recur. Right angles dominate. The use of standardized bricks implies not only centralized production, but mathematical foresight. Brick molds reflect ratios that remain consistent over centuries. This uniformity suggests adherence to an inherited canon. Later cultures treated these proportions as sacred. Numbers carried symbolic weight. Ratios were associated with harmony and order. Architecture became cosmological. Temples were built as models of the universe. This is not the behavior of a society discovering geometry for the first time. It is the behavior of one preserving a worldview encoded in form. Outside Mesopotamia, similar patterns emerge. In Egypt, the earliest pyramids appear with astonishing precision. The Great Pyramid aligns to true north with minimal error. Its dimensions encode ratios that still provoke debate, whether intentional or coincidental. The precision itself is undeniable. It suggests surveying knowledge that did not emerge gradually in visible form. Mainstream explanations often invoke lost trial and error phases that simply did not survive. This is possible, but when absence becomes systematic, it begins to feel less like chance and more like consequence. Catastrophe does not erase knowledge evenly. It spares what is portable and repeatable. Architecture also preserves memory through orientation. Many ancient structures align with solstices, equinoxes, or specific stars. This requires astronomical knowledge integrated into building practice. It also requires long-term planning, sometimes spanning decades. Such coordination implies cultural stability, anchored in inherited tradition. The builders did not explain these alignments in technical terms. They encoded them symbolically. The sun god enters the temple on a specific day. The king ascends toward the heavens. Ritual masks geometry, but the geometry remains. In a post-flood context, this makes sense. Survivors may remember how to build correctly, without remembering why the alignments mattered. Over time, explanation becomes myth, instruction becomes ritual. Precision survives disguised as devotion. This process also protects knowledge from corruption. Ritual resists change. It enforces repetition. Innovation becomes taboo. While this can stall progress, it preserves core structures across generations. In a fragile world, this trade-off may have felt necessary. The cost of such preservation is opacity. Future observers see ceremony without understanding. They see stone without theory. They assume superstition because the rationale is hidden. But absence of explanation does not imply absence of intelligence. The geometry embedded in early architecture feels intentional. It suggests a worldview in which space itself carried meaning. Measurements were not arbitrary. They connected earth to sky, human to cosmic order. This coherence is difficult to invent piecemeal. Some researchers argue that early builders inherited surveying techniques from an earlier civilization whose infrastructure did not survive. Stone outlasts wood. Knowledge outlasts stone. But context rarely outlasts catastrophe. The question becomes not whether ancient people were capable of precision, but why that precision appears so early and so fully formed. Why the learning curve is invisible. Why the rules are already in place. The simplest explanation may not be the most comfortable. Civilization may have restarted more than once. Each time it carried forward fragments judged essential. Geometry survived because it could be taught. Architecture survived because it embodied memory. Other systems may have depended on networks too complex to rebuild. The built environment thus becomes a quiet archive. Walls remember what voices forgot. Alignments persist after names vanish. Proportions endure even when their meaning dissolves. When later societies built upon these foundations, they often misunderstood them. They imitated forms without grasping principles. Yet the originals remained, anchoring continuity through sheer persistence. Stone does not argue. It does not explain itself. It waits. And in the angles and alignments of the oldest structures, there is a suggestion that humanity once knew how to shape space with intention, then lost the language to describe what it was doing. What remains is not evidence of primitiveness, but of inheritance under constraint. A world rebuilding itself from memory, setting stones carefully, in the hope that the pattern itself would remember what the mind could no longer fully recall. As stone preserves form and the sky preserves rhythm, story preserves something more elusive. Myth, often dismissed as fiction, functions in ancient cultures as a container. It holds what cannot be carried directly. When systems collapse and explanation becomes impossible, narrative absorbs what remains. In this way, myth is not the opposite of knowledge, but its last refuge. In Sumerian literature, myths are not whimsical entertainments. They are structured, repetitive, and restrained. They describe processes rather than fantasies. The descent of kingship, the organization of cities, the assignment of divine roles. These stories operate like compressed archives, encoding relationships and hierarchies that once may have been explicitly understood. Consider the way gods are portrayed. They are not omnipotent abstractions. They have domains. Enlil governs atmosphere and authority. Enki governs water, wisdom, and creation. Inanna governs cycles of fertility, power, and transition. These are not random personalities. They map onto natural systems and social functions. Myth becomes a diagram. When these gods act, they do so according to rules. Decisions are debated, councils convene, consequences unfold predictably. This internal consistency suggests more than imagination. It suggests modelling. Myth becomes a way of thinking through cause and effect when formal language has been lost. The flood narrative itself behaves like preserved data. It specifies duration, sequence, and aftermath. The warning is given. The vessel is constructed. the waters rise and fall. Life is released and tested. These are procedural steps. They feel instructional, even if their original purpose is no longer explicit. Across cultures, flood myths share striking similarities. A warning to a chosen survivor, a vessel built to precise dimensions, the preservation of life, the re-establishment of order. These parallels are often explained as archetypal storytelling, but archetypes do not usually agree on technical details. Procedures do. The consistency suggests that myth carried memory across linguistic and cultural resets. As people migrated or rebuilt, they brought stories that preserved essential sequences. Over time, the stories adapted, but their cores remained stable. Myth also protects knowledge by embedding it emotionally. Fear, reverence, awe. These ensure retention. A story about angry gods destroying the world is remembered more reliably than a technical manual about climate instability. Emotion becomes a storage medium. In post-catastrophe societies, myth may have been the only viable archive. Writing materials decay, institutions collapse. Oral tradition, reinforced through ritual, survives. Myths are repeated not because they are entertaining, but because they are necessary. This necessity shapes their form. Details that no longer make sense are preserved anyway. Names endure even when their referents are forgotten. This creates the illusion of nonsense to later observers, but nonsense often signals missing context. The gods themselves may represent more than anthropomorphic deities. Some scholars interpret them as personifications of natural forces or institutional roles. Others suggest they encode advanced understanding of environmental systems. Either way, their persistence implies function. As myth becomes dominant, explanation recedes. Ritual replaces reasoning. Correct performance matters more than understanding. This preserves outcomes while sacrificing theory. Over generations, the why disappears, but the how remains. This process can be seen in the ritual calendars tied to celestial events. Festivals align with solstices, equinoxes, and agricultural cycles. Participants may not know why the timing matters, only that it does. Myth anchors behavior to cosmic rhythms without requiring comprehension. The danger of myth is misinterpretation. As context erodes, stories are taken literally or dismissed entirely. Both responses miss their original purpose. Literalism freezes narrative into dogma. Dismissal discards encoded memory. Modern readers often oscillate between these extremes. They either defend myth as historical fact or reject it as fantasy. The possibility that myth is neither, but something more functional, is rarely explored. In Mesopotamia, myth coexists with administration. The same scribes who record grain shipments also copy epic poems. This suggests no sharp division between rational and symbolic thought. Both serve continuity. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself reflects this tension. Gilgamesh seeks immortality and fails. He returns to his city and admires its walls. The lesson is not about eternal life, but about preservation. Build something that endures. Accept limits. Remember what was lost. Myth thus becomes a guide for post-flood humanity. It teaches restraint, reverence, and continuity. It warns against hubris. It encodes survival strategies in narrative form. The cost is ambiguity. Later generations inherit stories without keys. They argue over meaning. They reinterpret symbols to fit new contexts. This keeps myth alive but also distorts it. Yet even distorted myths retain structure. Patterns persist, floods return, teachers withdraw, cycles repeat. These motifs hint at experiences too profound to vanish completely. The persistence of myth across cultures suggests a shared human response to deep loss. When explanation fails, story remains. When systems collapse, narrative carries fragments forward. This reframes myth not as evidence of primitive thinking, but as evidence of adaptive intelligence. A way to compress complexity into portable form. A way to ensure survival of meaning when infrastructure cannot be trusted. What myths remember, they remember imperfectly. But imperfection is preferable to silence. In their distortions lie clues. In their repetitions lie patterns. If early humanity was not primitive, then myth is not a childish invention. It is a sophisticated response to forgetting, a way to speak across ruptures in time. And within these ancient stories, repeated until their edges blur, there may still be data waiting to be read. Not as belief, but as memory shaped by loss. Beyond myth and monument, there remains a quieter trace of continuity. The figure of the survivor who does not rule, does not build empires, and does not remain visible for long. These figures pass through history briefly, leaving systems behind them like footprints that fade once the ground hardens. They are not remembered for what they possessed, but for what they transferred. In Mesopotamian tradition, these survivors are rarely celebrated. They are transitional. Ziusudra survives the flood, but he does not found a dynasty. He is removed from the human world, granted distance rather than authority. His role ends once continuity is secured. This pattern repeats across cultures. The survivor ensures transmission, then exits. This is an important distinction. Power and knowledge are separated. Kings rule cities, but they do not originate wisdom. Teachers deliver frameworks, but they do not govern. This separation suggests an awareness that authority and preservation require different temperaments. After catastrophe, consolidation may be necessary, but innovation becomes dangerous. The culture bearer operates under constraint. Time is limited. Resources are scarce. The goal is not advancement, but stabilization. What must survive is not everything, only what allows civilization to function at all. Language, measurement, calendars, ritual. These form a minimum viable structure for continuity. This selectivity explains the uneven survival of knowledge. Advanced understanding may have existed, but only parts were transferable without infrastructure. Complex systems, dependent on large populations, specialized labor, or delicate supply chains would not survive collapse. What endured were abstractions. Numbers survive because they can be taught orally. Geometry survives because it can be drawn in sand. Astronomy survives because the sky remains. Writing survives because symbols can be simplified. Other forms of knowledge may have vanished completely, not because they were less important, but because they were less portable. The survivor teacher appears to understand this. There is no attempt to preserve everything. Instead, there is triage. What is essential is encoded. What is not is allowed to disappear. This is not loss through ignorance, but loss through necessity. Over time, the recipients of this knowledge change. The first generation understands fragments. The next understands rituals. The third understands stories. Each layer adds interpretation while losing precision. This is how memory transforms into tradition. The handoff is fragile. It depends on trust. Teachers must be believed. Students must repeat accurately. Institutions must form to protect the transmission. In Mesopotamia, this role falls to temples and scribal schools. Elsewhere, it falls to priesthoods, councils, or hereditary lineages. The emphasis on lineage is telling. Knowledge is passed through families, often guarded through initiation. This ensures continuity, but also introduces distortion. Personal interpretation blends with inherited instruction. Over centuries, divergence increases. Yet even distorted systems retain a core. Calendars remain aligned. Measurements remain proportional. Stories retain sequence. This persistence suggests that early transmission was robust, designed to withstand misunderstanding. The survivor's disappearance is as important as their presence. By withdrawing, they prevent dependence. Humanity must operate independently, using what it has retained. This forces adaptation while preserving structure. In some traditions, the withdrawal is framed as punishment or exile. In others, as ascension. Either way, the message is consistent. The teacher cannot remain. Civilization must learn to sustain itself with inherited tools. This dynamic challenges modern assumptions about progress. We often assume that early societies were learning for the first time, but the presence of culture bearers suggests relearning, reassembly, a piecing together of fragments whose original coherence is gone. The silence surrounding these figures is striking. They do not leave autobiographies, they do not explain their origins. They are defined entirely by function. This anonymity suggests that identity mattered less than transmission. Archaeological evidence supports this view indirectly. There is little evidence of sudden population replacement after flood layers. Instead, continuity resumes quickly. This implies survivors who knew how to rebuild. Knowledge did not arrive from nowhere. It was already present, waiting to be applied. Comparative traditions reinforce this interpretation. In Polynesian navigation lore, wayfinders preserve star paths across generations without written maps. In indigenous Australian songlines, geography is encoded in narrative. These are not primitive techniques, they are resilient ones. Such systems prioritize redundancy. Knowledge is embedded in multiple forms: song, ritual, story, symbol. If one fails, another persists. This increases survival odds across disruption. The ancient world appears to have understood this intuitively. Knowledge was not centralized in a single medium. It was distributed across culture. This distribution made total erasure difficult, even when catastrophe struck. What we inherit today are these distributed remnants, fragments stabilized by repetition, patterns preserved by habit, meaning thinned by time. The danger lies in misreading survival as simplicity. Because what remains is stripped down, we assume it was always that way. But minimalism after collapse does not reflect original capacity. The survivors did not rebuild the old world. They built a smaller one, using tools that fit reduced conditions. Over time, that smaller world became normalized. Its limitations were forgotten, its origins mythologized. This normalization is powerful. It shapes identity. It convinces descendants that they began at the bottom, that progress is always upward, that loss is theoretical. Yet the persistent presence of inherited systems contradicts this narrative. They feel out of place, too coherent, too early. They hint at an origin story that does not align with gradualism. The culture bearer stands at the edge of this contradiction, a figure who bridges worlds without belonging fully to either. They are the reason continuity exists at all, and the reason its origin remains obscured. In their quiet departure, they leave behind a civilization that functions but does not fully understand itself, a world capable of counting the stars but uncertain why it began counting in the first place. And within that uncertainty, history unfolds, shaped as much by what was carried forward as by what was left behind in the receding waters of memory. Even when stories fade and monuments crumble, the earth itself remembers. Beneath cities and beneath seas, there are scars that do not belong to myth or metaphor. They belong to pressure, motion, and sudden change. When read carefully, these scars echo the same interruption preserved in tablets and tales, suggesting that the memory of catastrophe may be grounded as much in geology as in culture. Across Mesopotamia, layers of silt interrupt human occupation, like punctuation marks. These flood deposits are not uniform river sediments laid down gently over time. They are abrupt, thick, out of place. At sites such as Kish, and Shurapak, archaeologists uncovered strata that separate older, organised settlements from later ones, as if a curtain had fallen and risen again. Above the silt, life resumes. Below it, life had already been established. This pattern extends beyond Mesopotamia. In the Black Sea region, evidence suggests a rapid rise in sea level around the end of the last ice age, transforming freshwater environments into saltwater basins. Coastal settlements may have been swallowed in a generation. In the Mediterranean, submerged structures hint at shorelines now lost. Around the world, ancient ports sit far inland or far underwater, displaced by shifting waters. Geology does not tell stories, it records outcomes. But when outcomes align with memory across cultures, the alignment deserves attention. Flood myths appear on every inhabited continent. While details vary, the core experience repeats. Rising waters, sudden loss, survival through warning or chance, and a reshaped world. This is not the memory of seasonal flooding. It is the memory of something overwhelming. Ice core samples and sediment records point to periods of rapid climate change at the end of the Pleistocene. Meltwater pulses raised sea levels dramatically over relatively short timescales. What would this have meant for coastal populations with long-established settlements, trade networks, and cultural memory? Displacement would not have been gradual. It would have been shocking. Such events leave psychological scars as well as physical ones. A society that witnesses the destruction of its world does not easily forget. Even when generations pass, the memory persists, reshaped into narrative, ritual, and cautionary tale. The earth may heal, but the memory lingers. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions around 12,900 years ago, offers another layer of disruption. Temperatures dropped rapidly, ecosystems shifted, megafauna vanished. human societies would have been forced to adapt quickly or collapse. This was not a slow transition into agriculture. It was a test of resilience under stress. Some researchers have proposed that fragments of these events are preserved in ancient traditions describing a time when the sun behaved differently, when seasons were unstable, when the world was out of balance. Such descriptions, often dismissed as symbolic, may reflect lived experience of environmental chaos. Catastrophe does not need to be global to feel universal. A sufficiently severe regional event, experienced by interconnected populations, can propagate memory across vast distances. Trade networks carry stories. Migrants carry warnings. Over time, separate events may blur into a single remembered disaster. This blending complicates interpretation. Not every flood myth refers to the same event. Not every geological scar aligns chronologically, but the persistence of the theme suggests that humanity has endured repeated resets, each reinforcing the expectation of collapse. What matters is not pinpointing a single flood, but recognizing a pattern of disruption large enough to fracture continuity. Civilizations do not need to vanish completely to lose context. A partial collapse can be enough to sever explanation from practice. When survivors rebuild, they do so with altered priorities: safety over expansion, preservation over innovation, memory over ambition. This shift shapes culture long after the immediate danger has passed. Geological time does not align neatly with historical time. Layers compress millennia into inches. Human memory stretches moments into eternity. When these two scales intersect, interpretation becomes difficult, yet both suggest interruption. Modern resistance to catastrophic explanations often stems from discomfort. Gradualism feels safer. It implies control. Catastrophe implies vulnerability. It reminds us that complexity does not guarantee survival. Ancient societies did not share this illusion. Their myths, rituals, and institutions reflect an awareness of fragility. The earth had changed before, it could change again. Stability was conditional. This awareness may explain the emphasis on cycles. Time was not linear progress, but repetition. Ages rose and fell. Orders emerged and dissolved. Humanity persisted by adapting, not by assuming permanence. Geological scars reinforce this worldview. They show that the planet itself operates in pulses. Calm periods punctuated by upheaval, stability followed by sudden rearrangement. In such a world, knowledge must be portable, resilient, and adaptable. The alignment between geological evidence and cultural memory does not prove that ancient accounts are literal histories. It suggests something more subtle, that myth and science may be describing the same experiences through different languages. Where geology records sediment and erosion, myth records fear and survival. Where science measures sea level rise, story remembers drowning worlds. Both point toward disruption as a defining force. This reframes the question of ancient sophistication. A society that has endured collapse and rebuilt is not naive. It is cautious. It designs systems that can survive loss. It encodes knowledge redundantly. It looks to the sky and stone because those endure when cities do not. The scars in the earth are silent, but they are not meaningless. They form a backdrop against which early civilizations make more sense. Sudden complexity followed by conservatism. Advanced systems preserved but not expanded. Memory without explanation. We tend to imagine prehistory as static, uneventful, waiting patiently for civilization to begin. The earth suggests otherwise. It remembers turbulence. It remembers water moving where land once stood. If humanity's early chapters were written during times of instability, then the loss we sense in ancient records is not accidental. It is structural. It is what happens when worlds end and new ones begin atop their remains. The floodwaters recede, silt settles, people rebuild. But beneath their feet, the earth holds a record of what was erased. And above them, stories continue to whisper that the world has been remade before and maybe again. As the accumulated fragments of deep history begin to press against the boundaries of accepted timelines, a subtler force becomes visible. It is not the flood, nor the sages, nor the vanished cities. It is the mechanism by which memory itself is shaped, narrowed, and made acceptable. Long after catastrophe fades from lived experience, control over narrative quietly determines what survives. Civilizations do not inherit the past intact. They inherit pieces, filtered through institutions that require coherence. A story that wanders too far from order threatens stability. And so, over generations, history is not erased outright. It is edited. In the ancient Near East, this process can be observed in how earlier knowledge was preserved yet contained. Sumerian texts were copied meticulously by later Akkadian scribes, but rarely expanded upon. The language became ceremonial, its meanings fixed in glossaries rather than lived usage. This preservation without evolution froze knowledge in place. It could be revered, but not interrogated. Once knowledge becomes sacred, it becomes untouchable. Sacred things are protected from alteration, but also from scrutiny. Questions that might destabilize authority are discouraged not by force, but by reverence. In this way, preservation and suppression become indistinguishable. As empires replaced one another, each inherited the symbolic capital of the past. Ancient origins legitimized rule. Kings traced authority backward, not forward. They did not claim to invent order, but to restore it. This restoration narrative required a stable past, not a complicated one. A past marked by collapse. Lost sophistication or forgotten systems introduces doubt. It implies that legitimacy can evaporate, that the gods withdraw. That order is temporary. Such ideas are dangerous to centralized power. Religious frameworks absorb these ancient memories and reframe them morally. The flood became a judgment, not an environmental event. Survival became righteousness, not preparedness. This shift transformed catastrophe into lesson, and lesson into obedience. The memory remained, but its warning changed direction. Over time, the physical reality of disaster faded, while the moral interpretation hardened. The Earth's instability became less important than humanity's behavior. This reframing made catastrophe manageable. It placed responsibility within human control, even if falsely. As historical writing evolved, especially in the modern era, another filter emerged. Linear chronology became the standard. Progress became assumed. Anything that implied regression or repetition was treated with suspicion. Anomalies were tolerated only as curiosities. Evidence that did not fit neatly into linear development was isolated. It was labelled myth, exaggeration, or coincidence. Rarely was it allowed to challenge the framework itself. This was not censorship. It was structural inertia. Academic disciplines, by necessity, divide complexity into manageable categories. Archaeology studies artifacts. Mythology studies stories. Geology studies earth. Astronomy studies sky. When each remains isolated, the larger pattern becomes invisible. Yet it is precisely at their intersections that the uncomfortable implications appear. When myths align with sediment layers, when architecture aligns with stars, when numbers appear fully formed, the fragmentation of study becomes a shield against synthesis. This fragmentation protects certainty. It allows each field to function without confronting questions that exceed its scope. But it also ensures that no single narrative ever fully accounts for the evidence. The result is a past that feels simultaneously rich and incomplete, detailed in part and silent in crucial transitions. Civilization appears to emerge fully equipped, yet no explanation is offered for how that equipment was assembled. This silence becomes normalized. Students are taught beginnings without origins, innovations without precursors. The gaps are acknowledged but rarely explored. There is comfort in this arrangement. It preserves the idea of forward motion. It situates modern humanity as culmination rather than continuation. It reassures us that what we possess was earned through steady improvement. But comfort is not the same as accuracy. The ancient world, as glimpsed through its own records, did not share this confidence. Its obsession with cycles, omens, and memory suggests a people aware that order can dissolve, that knowledge can be lost, that beginnings are not guaranteed. The reluctance to fully engage with this perspective today may reflect fear rather than evidence. To accept that advanced knowledge existed and was lost is to accept vulnerability. It is to admit that civilization is not self-correcting. Such admission destabilizes modern assumptions about permanence. It challenges faith in institutions. It implies that forgetting's not failure, but pattern. History then becomes less a ladder and more a shoreline. Waves advance and retreat. Structures rise and erode. What remains visible depends on timing. The management of memory does not require conspiracy. It emerges naturally from survival instincts. Societies under pressure simplify. They select narratives that support cohesion. They discard those that invite doubt. Yet discarded narratives have a way of resurfacing, not intact but as fragments. A number that doesn't fit, a myth that refuses to die, a structure that aligns too precisely to be accidental. These fragments accumulate quietly. They do not overthrow established history. They sit alongside it, waiting for synthesis. What makes this moment different is not new evidence, but new willingness. Disciplines begin to overlap. Technology allows patterns to be compared. Old assumptions loosen. Still, resistance remains. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications are heavy. To remember deeply is to carry responsibility forward. If civilization has collapsed before, it can collapse again. If knowledge has been lost, it can be lost again. If the past is not primitive, then the future is not guaranteed. The ancient silence around certain questions may have been protective. Forgetting can be merciful. It allows rebuilding without paralysis. But forgetting also repeats mistakes. The fragments preserved across millennia do not demand belief. They ask for patience, for attention, for the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than resolve it too quickly. History, when allowed to speak across disciplines, does not offer a clean story. It offers a warning embedded in memory, a reminder that progress is fragile, and that what we call the beginning may already be the aftermath. What remains to be seen is whether modern civilization will recognize this pattern as reflection or dismiss it as coincidence. The past has already shown what happens when warnings are misunderstood. The choice, as always, lies not in what the evidence says, but in what we are willing to hear. As the story of deep time grows heavier, the comparison with other ancient traditions becomes unavoidable. The Sumerian record does not stand alone in its insistence on a lost age before catastrophe. Across continents and cultures, similar memories surface, not as identical copies, but as variations shaped by geography and language. These echoes suggest not coincidence, but a shared human experience refracted through many lenses. In the Hebrew tradition, the flood is framed as a moral reckoning, yet the structure mirrors older Mesopotamian accounts. A chosen survivor is warned. A vessel is built according to exact instructions. Life is preserved. The world is cleansed. Afterward, human lifespans shorten, and history narrows. The parallels are too specific to dismiss as independent invention. In ancient India, texts describe cycles of creation and destruction known as yugas. Time is not linear but repeating. Civilizations rise, flourish, and collapse in vast epochs. Knowledge is lost and later recovered. These are not myths of beginnings, but of recurrence. The implication is clear. Humanity has been here before. Greek tradition preserves the memory of successive ages, each less luminous than the last. The golden age fades into silver, then bronze, then iron. With each transition, virtue declines and suffering increases. The past is portrayed as superior, not primitive. Progress moves backward. In Mesoamerica, flood myths and sun cycles describe previous worlds destroyed by water, fire, or wind. Humanity survives through adaptation and guidance from culture heroes who arrive knowing how to restore order. These heroes do not invent agriculture or astronomy, they reintroduce them. Indigenous Australian traditions speak of the dream time, a primordial era when ancestral beings shaped the land and established law. This time is not past, but foundational. It exists beneath the present, accessible through ritual. Knowledge is inherited, not discovered. In China, early chronicles describe ancient sage kings who ruled with wisdom bestowed from heaven. Their reigns are long, orderly, and virtuous. Later rulers are measured against this ideal and found lacking. History moves away from perfection. These traditions vary widely, yet they share key elements: a distant age of greater order, a catastrophe or decline, the survival of fragments, the role of teachers who withdraw, the sense that the present is diminished. This consistency challenges the assumption that early humans universally perceived themselves as emerging from ignorance. Instead, many cultures remembered themselves as descending from a height. Skeptics often attribute these similarities to psychological archetypes. While archetypes explain repetition of themes, they struggle to account for shared structure, the sequence of events, the roles assigned, the emphasis on loss over creation. All point toward memory rather than fantasy. Trade and migration provide plausible pathways for these memories to spread. Early human networks were more extensive than once believed. Ideas travel more easily than populations. A powerful story, tied to survival, would persist. Yet even independent experiences could converge. If multiple societies endured large-scale disruptions near the end of the last ice age, their memories would align naturally. Floods, climate shifts, and resource collapse would produce similar narratives. What matters is not whether there was one flood or many, but that catastrophe became central to human self-understanding. Civilization did not arise in a vacuum. It arose in the shadow of loss. This shadow shaped values: respect for ancestors, reverence for tradition, fear of hubris, obsession with cycles. These are not traits of naive societies. They are traits of societies that have learned caution. The persistence of these themes suggests that early humanity understood its fragility. It did not assume permanence. It prepared for repetition. Comparative mythology thus reinforces the idea that the ancient world was not primitive in self-conception. It saw itself as inheriting a broken legacy. Modern narratives often flatten these traditions into entertainment or moral allegory. In doing so, they strip them of their historical weight. They become stories about others, not about us. Yet the recurrence of these memories across cultures suggests something more personal: a shared human inheritance of loss. The danger of ignoring this inheritance is not academic. It shapes how societies respond to instability. A culture that believes collapse is impossible will not recognize warning signs. A culture that remembers collapse will. The ancient emphasis on balance, restraint, and harmony reflects this awareness. Excess invites correction. Disruption is inevitable. Wisdom lies in alignment, not conquest. When viewed together, the world's flood traditions form a mosaic, each piece incomplete, each distorted, yet together revealing an image of a past shaped by upheaval and recovery. This mosaic does not demand literal belief in every detail. It asks for respect for the experience behind them, an experience profound enough to imprint itself across continents. The idea that ancient civilizations shared memories of a world before catastrophe does not diminish human achievement. It deepens it. It suggests resilience across cycles of destruction. We are not the first to build, to measure, to observe the sky, or to wonder about our place in time. We are participants in a long process of remembering and forgetting. The comparison with other traditions does not close the mystery. It expands it. If so many cultures remembered loss, then loss was not peripheral. It was formative. What remains unresolved is how much of that formative experience we have chosen to reinterpret, domesticate, or dismiss. The stories endure, but their implications remain largely unexplored. In their quiet agreement across time and space, these traditions continue to whisper the same unsettling suggestion: that humanity's true beginning lies not in ascent, but in recovery, and that what we call ancient history may already be the second draft of a much older world. As the patterns from distant cultures settle into alignment, attention turns inward, toward absence. Not what survived, but what did not. The surviving fragments of ancient knowledge are impressive, yet they feel incomplete, like outlines without shading. This incompleteness is not random. It reflects selection, whether conscious or imposed by circumstance. What remains from the earliest civilizations emphasizes structure over process. We inherit measurements, calendars, architectural ratios, and mythic frameworks. What we rarely inherit are explanations. The how persists, the why dissolves. This imbalance suggests that early societies preserved what could function independently of context. Complex systems depend on networks. They require specialized roles, surplus resources, and stable populations. When catastrophe disrupts these conditions, such systems fail first. What survives are abstractions that can be carried by individuals or small groups, knowledge that fits in memory rather than infrastructure. Mathematics survives because it can be taught with marks and words. Geometry survives because it can be drawn. Astronomy survives because the sky is always present. But technologies dependent on precise materials, energy sources, or large-scale coordination would not survive collapse intact. This explains the uneven sophistication of ancient remains. Theoretical understanding appears advanced, while practical application seems constrained. Builders know proportions but work with limited tools. Astronomers know cycles but lack instruments. The mind remembers more than the hand can reproduce. The selective survival of knowledge shapes perception. Later observers see impressive ideas paired with modest execution and assume primitive capability. They do not consider that execution reflects available conditions, not original understanding. Ritual plays a key role in this selection. Ritual preserves action without requiring comprehension. It encodes timing, sequence, and alignment. Participants repeat gestures whose meanings may be forgotten, yet outcomes remain effective. Crops are planted at the right time. Structures align correctly. Communities remain synchronized with natural cycles. Over generations, ritual becomes opaque. Symbol replaces explanation. Reverence replaces understanding. This protects practice, but obscures origin. Knowledge becomes tradition. Language contributes to this erosion. Technical vocabulary fades. Metaphor fills the gap. Concepts once described precisely become personified. Forces become gods. Processes become stories. This transformation is not corruption. It is adaptation. What is lost in this process is integration. Early knowledge likely functioned as a cohesive worldview. Astronomy, geometry, ecology, and governance may have been interlinked. After collapse, these domains fragment. Each survives in isolation, stripped of context. The absence of this integration is palpable. Ancient texts feel compartmentalized. Astronomical observations exist without theoretical models. Architectural precision exists without engineering treatises. Myths exist without commentary. The connective tissue is missing. This absence invites speculation but also restraint. It cautions against projecting modern assumptions backward. The lost knowledge may not resemble modern science. It may have operated through frameworks unfamiliar to contemporary categories. Selective memory also reflects value judgments. What early survivors chose to preserve reveals priorities. Order mattered. Predictability mattered. Alignment with cycles mattered. Mastery over nature mattered less than accommodation. This worldview contrasts with modern narratives of conquest and control. Ancient cultures often framed humanity as subject to larger rhythms. Disruption was expected. Stability was temporary. Knowledge was for alignment, not domination. Such values influence what is remembered. Techniques for living within limits endure. Techniques for expansion vanish. This may explain why ancient texts emphasize harmony over growth. The loss of certain knowledge does not imply its absence. It implies its incompatibility with reduced conditions. Knowledge that required abundance would not survive scarcity. Knowledge that required centralization would not survive fragmentation. Over time, the surviving fragments become reinterpreted. Later societies build upon them without realizing they are incomplete. They innovate to fill gaps, sometimes successfully, sometimes redundantly. This process creates the illusion of linear progress. In reality, progress may involve rediscovering what was once known differently, reinventing tools to solve problems previously addressed through other frameworks. The danger lies in mistaking reinvention for origin. When context is lost, inheritance masquerades as innovation. Modern societies may rediscover principles without recognizing them as echoes. The selective memory of ancient civilization also affects identity. If humanity believes it began in simplicity, it frames advancement as destiny. If humanity remembers loss, it frames advancement as recovery. The ancient world leaned toward the latter. Its obsession with ancestry, cycles, and precedent reflects this orientation. The past was not a blank slate, it was a reference point. The cost of forgetting this orientation is overconfidence, a belief that collapse belongs only to others, that complexity guarantees resilience, that knowledge once gained cannot be lost. Ancient societies did not share this belief. Their institutions, myths, and rituals all suggest an awareness of fragility. Knowledge was guarded because it was vulnerable. Selective memory thus becomes both shield and wound. It protects what remains but marks what is gone. The gaps are not failures of imagination, they are scars. Modern archaeology often celebrates discovery without mourning loss. It catalogues artifacts without acknowledging the systems that made them meaningful. This approach yields data but not understanding. To engage fully with ancient evidence requires accepting incompleteness. It requires listening to silence as carefully as to sound. The absence of explanation becomes part of the message. What was lost may never be recovered directly, but its outline can be inferred through what remains, through patterns that appear too coherent to be accidental, through alignments that persist across cultures. The ancient world appears not as a starting point, but as a reduced echo of something earlier, a world that knew enough to preserve essentials and let the rest go. This letting go was not choice in the modern sense, it was adaptation, survival under constraint. In this light, the sophistication of early civilizations becomes more remarkable, not less. They achieved continuity despite loss. They rebuilt order without full understanding. They maintained alignment with natural cycles across generations of uncertainty. What remains today is a mosaic of survival strategies, fragmented, ritualized, mythologized, each piece shaped by what catastrophe allowed to endure. The task of interpretation is not to fill gaps with fantasy, but to respect the shape of absence, to recognize that what is missing once mattered deeply. The silence between ancient systems is not emptiness. It is the space left when coherence collapses. And in that space, the ancient world continues to speak, not through what it says, but through what it no longer can. Between what survives and what is lost, there exists a pause that rarely receives attention. It is not a gap filled with ignorance, but a silence shaped by interruption. In the archaeological record, this silence appears as missing layers, abandoned sites, sudden shifts in material culture. In the historical record, it appears as abrupt beginnings that arrive without preparation. Civilization seems to resume mid-sentence. This silence is most evident where continuity should be loudest. Writing systems appear fully formed, yet their developmental stages are absent. Cities rise with established layouts, yet their planning traditions arrive without preface. Social hierarchies emerge already defined, as if inherited rather than negotiated. These absences are often explained away as preservation bias. Organic materials decay. Early experiments vanish. Time erases evidence unevenly. While these explanations are valid, their repetition begins to feel insufficient. The pattern of absence is too consistent, too aligned across domains. What is missing is not random debris. It is context. The scaffolding that explains why systems look the way they do. The logic that connects fragments into a whole. When archaeologists excavate a site and find a sudden break, they describe it as abandonment. But abandonment implies intention. It suggests people left, not slowly dispersed. Something prompted departure, something decisive. In Mesopotamia, multiple cities show synchronized disruption. Occupation layers end abruptly. Construction halts. Then, after a period of silence, activity resumes nearby or atop the same site. The pause is not long in geological terms, but it is decisive in cultural terms. These pauses suggest moments when continuity failed, when transmission broke down, when explanation could not cross the threshold. Silence is uncomfortable for historical narratives. It resists interpretation. It cannot be dated precisely. It offers no artifacts to display, yet it carries meaning. In human experience, silence often follows shock. After trauma, speech falters, memory fragments. Survivors repeat what they can, omit what they cannot. Over time, these omissions harden into gaps. The ancient record feels shaped by this dynamic. The earliest texts do not celebrate beginnings. They record restoration. They list kings after the flood. They describe cities rebuilt. They lament what is gone. This implies that those who wrote them were already aware of discontinuity. They did not attempt to bridge the gap with speculation. They marked it and moved on. Modern interpretation often tries to fill these silences with developmental narratives. Gradual progress, slow invention, incremental learning. These models smooth the break, but they do not explain the confidence that appears immediately after. Confidence is not born from experimentation alone. It grows from familiarity. The early confidence of ancient systems suggests remembered practice rather than first attempts. The silence also appears in mythology. Stories leap from creation to catastrophe, from catastrophe to order. The in-between is compressed or omitted. This compression mirrors psychological response. Painful transitions are shortened in retelling. Over generations, silence becomes tradition. People repeat what was said, not what was unsaid. The absence becomes invisible, yet the shape of silence can be traced. It appears wherever complexity re-emerges too quickly, wherever systems align across domains without explanation, wherever knowledge feels older than its carriers. The silence between layers of history is not empty time, it is active forgetting, a period when survival took precedence over explanation, when rebuilding mattered more than reflection. This forgetting was not total, it was selective. Enough remained to function, not enough to remember origins. Later cultures inherited this selective memory and normalized it. They accepted the systems they received as beginnings rather than remnants. Over time, this acceptance solidified into assumption. The danger of assumption is complacency. When gaps are treated as origins, questions stop forming. Curiosity narrows. Yet the gaps remain, quietly resisting closure. They surface whenever disparate evidence aligns too well, whenever myth echoes geology, whenever numbers arrive ahead of theory. These alignments pull attention back to the silence. They suggest that something cohesive once existed in the space, now empty. This does not require imagining a single lost civilization in the modern sense. It requires accepting that knowledge networks can dissolve while leaving functional fragments behind. A silence shaped by collapse would not look like erasure. It would look like truncation. Systems would survive without manuals, practices without philosophy, results without rationale. This is exactly what appears in the ancient world: precision without explanation, continuity without origin, memory without context. The silence also shapes how history feels. There is a melancholy in ancient texts, a sense of distance from a better ordered past, a recurring theme of decline. This tone is not typical of societies confident in novelty. It belongs to societies aware of loss. The silence does not accuse, it does not warn directly, it simply exists, marking where continuity broke. Modern frameworks often treat silence as a problem to solve, a gap to fill. But silence can also be evidence. It can indicate trauma, disruption, reset. When enough silences align, they form a pattern of interrupted transmission across cultures and eras. This pattern suggests that the ancient world was not climbing steadily upward from ignorance. It was stabilizing after descent. The difference matters. Stabilization values preservation. It favors repetition. It mistrusts innovation. It anchors authority in the past. These values permeate ancient societies. They explain conservatism in ritual, reverence for ancestors, fear of deviation. They also explain why ancient knowledge feels both advanced and constrained, capable but cautious, sophisticated but restrained. The silence between layers of history thus becomes a defining feature rather than a flaw. It marks the boundary between what could be saved and what could not. Listening to this silence requires restraint. It resists dramatic conclusions. It offers no names, no dates, no monuments. It offers only implication. That something coherent ended. That what followed was shaped by survival rather than ambition. The ancient record does not shout this truth. It whispers it in omissions, pauses, and abrupt resumptions. And in those quiet spaces, history reveals itself not as a smooth ascent, but as a series of recoveries separated by forgetting. The silence remains because it was never meant to be filled. It was meant to be endured. What we hear when we attend to it is not absence, but the echo of a world whose full voice did not survive, leaving behind fragments that still carry the weight of what once connected them. As the fragments of ancient memory accumulate, a subtle reversal begins to take shape. What once appeared as progress now looks increasingly like compensation. What we call advancement may, in many cases, be an attempt to recover equilibrium rather than surpass it. This reframing alters not only how we view the past, but how we measure the present. Early civilizations appear obsessed with balance, harmony between heaven and earth, proportion in architecture, cycles in time, justice as alignment rather than innovation. These priorities suggest a culture less concerned with expansion than with maintenance. Order was something to be preserved carefully, not pushed beyond its limits. Such restraint is difficult to reconcile with the idea of humanity discovering civilization for the first time. Discovery invites experimentation. Experimentation invites excess. Yet the ancient record repeatedly emphasizes caution. Laws are framed as restorations. Rituals reenact original acts. Kings present themselves as stewards, not visionaries. This conservatism makes sense in a world that remembers collapse. When stability has been lost once, it becomes sacred. Innovation becomes suspect. Change is tolerated only when framed as return. The cost of this mindset is stagnation. But stagnation is preferable to annihilation. The ancient world appears to have chosen survival over ambition, continuity over novelty. Over time, however, conditions change. Populations grow. Resources stabilize. Memory of catastrophe fades. The protective shell of tradition begins to loosen. Innovation resumes, slowly at first, then accelerating. What emerges is not a straight line upward, but oscillation. Periods of consolidation followed by bursts of expansion. Each expansion carries within it the seeds of future instability. Modern civilization often sees itself as unprecedented in scale and capability. Yet this self-image may reflect forgetting rather than uniqueness. The tools are different. The pattern may not be. The loss of ancient restraint coincides with the loss of ancient memory. As cycles are forgotten, confidence grows. As confidence grows, vulnerability increases. The ancient emphasis on alignment with nature contrasts sharply with modern ideals of control. Where ancient societies sought to predict and accommodate natural forces, modern societies seek to dominate them. This shift represents not advancement of wisdom, but change of posture. The past, as preserved in fragmentary form, suggests that earlier civilizations understood limits intimately. They watched the sky not for curiosity, but for warning. They measured land not for profit, but for balance. They encoded ethics into cosmology because survival depended on coherence. When those constraints loosened, new possibilities emerged. Technology accelerated. Abstraction detached from environment. Humanity gained power, but lost reference. This loss of reference is subtle. It manifests as disconnection. Systems grow complex yet brittle. Knowledge multiplies, yet integration falters. Progress accelerates, yet meaning fragments. In this light, ancient sophistication appears not as technological superiority, but as contextual depth. They may not have built machines like ours, but they built systems that assumed fragility. Their worldview was calibrated to survival across cycles, not domination within one. The modern narrative often measures intelligence by output, speed, scale, novelty. Ancient intelligence may have been measured by endurance, alignment, redundancy. This difference matters. A system optimized for speed behaves differently under stress than one optimized for resilience. The ancient world seems to have favored the latter. The repeated appearance of reset myths suggests that ancient people expected collapse, not as punishment, but as phase. This expectation shaped how they stored knowledge, redundantly, symbolically, ritually. Modern systems, by contrast, often store knowledge centrally, digitally, fragile to disruption. Efficiency replaces redundancy, speed replaces memory. This is not an argument against progress, it is an observation about trade-offs. What is gained in expansion may be lost in resilience. The ancient world appears to have understood this intuitively. Its obsession with cycles reflects acceptance of impermanence. Its reverence for ancestors reflects trust in precedent. Its resistance to change reflects fear earned through experience. The gradual erosion of this mindset may be the true marker of modernity, not technological capacity, but loss of humility before collapse. This erosion affects interpretation of the past. When collapse is unimaginable, ancient warnings seem exaggerated. Myths become fantasy. Conservatism becomes superstition. But if collapse is remembered, those same elements look different. They appear as survival strategies encoded culturally. The cost of forgetting ancient restraint is repetition. Without memory of limits, expansion continues unchecked. Without expectation of collapse, preparation diminishes. The ancient record does not demand return to the past. It offers perspective. It suggests that what we call progress may not be cumulative wisdom, but cyclical adaptation. This perspective reframes the question of primitive versus advanced. Advancement is not linear. Sophistication can exist without complexity. Wisdom can precede technology. The ancient world may have been advanced in ways that do not map onto modern metrics. Advanced in integration, in patience, in long-term awareness. The loss of these qualities does not negate modern achievement. It contextualizes it. It reminds us that capability without memory is incomplete. The fragments we inherit from ancient civilizations hint at a worldview calibrated for survival across deep time. One that assumed interruption. One that valued continuity over conquest. As memory of collapse faded, ambition grew. As ambition grew, systems expanded beyond their original safeguards. This may be the defining arc of civilization. The question then becomes not whether ancient humanity was advanced, but advanced in what direction. If their intelligence was oriented toward endurance rather than acceleration, then modern civilization represents not evolution, but divergence. This divergence carries risk. Without the ancient expectation of reset, modern systems may be unprepared for it. The past does not offer a blueprint. It offers a warning embedded in structure rather than instruction. In the careful alignment of temples, in the repetition of cycles, in the reluctance to innovate, there is an implied lesson. That stability is temporary, that forgetting is dangerous, that resilience requires humility. The fragments survive not to be admired, but to be recognized. What they suggest is not nostalgia for a lost golden age, but caution against assuming that complexity equals permanence. The ancient world, reduced but not ignorant, appears to have understood something that modern civilization is still relearning, that progress without memory is not advancement, but acceleration toward the next silence. And that silence, once it arrives, does not ask whether a society believed itself primitive or advanced. It only records whether it remembered enough to endure. As the long thread of this inquiry approaches its furthest visible edge, what remains is not a revelation, but a tension, a quiet pressure between what the ancient world seems to imply and what the modern world prefers to assume. The evidence does not collapse into certainty. It arranges itself into a question that refuses resolution. The world before the flood, as remembered through Sumerian tablets, architectural alignments, astronomical precision, and global echoes, does not resemble a fumbling beginning. It resembles an aftermath, a landscape shaped by restraint, memory, and selective survival. A civilization already aware of loss, this awareness changes how the ancient record reads. Early achievements no longer feel miraculous, they feel deliberate. Writing, measurement, law, and cosmology appear not as sparks of genius, but as tools chosen carefully from a larger kit that could not be fully carried forward. The past, in this light, is not mysterious because it is primitive, but because it is incomplete. We are looking at a reduced version of something once more integrated, and reduction leaves traces. It leaves coherence without explanation, sophistication without context. Modern scholarship often asks how ancient people achieved such feats with such limited technology. The question itself may be misplaced. The more difficult question is how much they once understood that we no longer recognize as understanding. Knowledge does not have to resemble modern science to be effective. It only has to work within its environment. Ancient systems worked. They aligned societies with cycles. They stabilized food production. They preserved order across generations. That effectiveness matters more than resemblance. The tendency to measure the past by modern categories obscures this. When ancient knowledge does not fit contemporary frameworks, it is dismissed or minimized. But difference does not imply inferiority, it implies alternative orientation. If early civilizations inherited fragments from a pre-catastrophic world, then their focus on harmony, repetition, and restraint reflects wisdom adapted to fragility. They did not assume permanence, they assumed interruption. This assumption shaped everything: how cities were built, how time was measured, how authority was justified, how stories were told. The flood was not just an event, it was a reminder embedded in culture. Over time, as stability returned and memory faded, these reminders became ritual. Ritual became habit. Habit became tradition. Tradition became identity. And identity gradually forgot its origin. The modern world stands at a similar threshold, though it rarely recognizes it as such. Our systems are complex, efficient, and expansive. They assume continuity. They assume growth. They assume that tomorrow will resemble today. The ancient world did not make this assumption. Its myths insist otherwise. Its architecture encodes caution. Its calendars repeat cycles endlessly, as if rehearsing for return. The question is not whether the ancient world possessed technologies beyond ours. There is no need to imagine lost machines or forbidden sciences. The question is whether they possess perspectives we have abandoned. Perspective shapes survival more than tools. A society that expects collapse prepares differently than one that expects ascent. A society that remembers loss builds redundantly. One that forgets optimizes away resilience. The evidence suggests that early civilizations optimized for endurance. They preserved what could survive disruption. They encoded knowledge into stories, rituals, and alignments that could persist without explanation. Modern civilization optimizes for speed. It centralizes knowledge. It trusts efficiency. It treats redundancy as waste. These choices make sense within a stable frame. They are dangerous within a cyclical one. The ancient record does not accuse the present. It does not demand regression. It offers perspective shaped by experience rather than theory. If humanity has already passed through at least one great reset, then our current position is not unique. It is familiar. The feeling of permanence that surrounds modern life may be the same illusion that preceded earlier silences. This does not diminish human achievement. It reframes responsibility. To know that civilization can forget is to recognize that memory must be cultivated intentionally. The past does not survive intact. It survives in fragments. Those fragments do not tell us exactly what happened. They tell us how it felt to live after something ended. The Sumerians did not describe themselves as pioneers. They described themselves as caretakers. Kingship descended. Wisdom was restored. Cities were rebuilt. This language matters. It suggests humility before time, an understanding that humanity participates in cycles larger than itself. Modern narratives often reject this humility. They frame the past as preparation for the present. They frame the future as open-ended expansion. But the ancient record complicates this optimism. It suggests that expansion is episodic, that collapse is not failure but phase, that what matters is not how far a civilization advances, but how well it remembers. The question left unresolved is not whether the world before the flood was advanced. It is whether advancement itself is the correct lens. If sophistication once existed and was lost, then the measure of civilization is not accumulation, but continuity. Not innovation, but integration. Not dominance, but alignment. The fragments left behind invite contemplation rather than conclusion. They do not reconstruct a lost world. They point toward an attitude that expects disruption. That encodes knowledge defensively. That treats memory as survival. As this journey reaches its final stillness, what remains is not an answer, but an image. Humanity standing on rebuilt ground, using inherited tools, telling stories about a flood it no longer fully understands, yet never quite forgets. The ancient world speaking through gaps and echoes seems to offer a final caution that the most dangerous moment for any civilization is not when it is struggling to survive, but when it is confident it no longer needs to remember how survival was once achieved. Whether we choose to hear that caution or file it away as myth may determine whether the next silence becomes another beginning or the last word. And somewhere, beneath layers of story and stone, the shoreline waits again, quiet, patient and unchanged, as if it has seen this moment before. As the final layer of this long memory settles, the question that remains is not about dates, artifacts or proof. It is quieter than that and heavier. It concerns who we become when we decide what the past is allowed to be. History is often treated as a finished landscape, mapped and bordered, its uncertainties fenced off as myth or speculation. Yet the deeper we listen, the more that landscape feels provisional. The ancient world does not sit comfortably behind us. It presses forward, unresolved, shaping assumptions we rarely examine. The idea that the world before the Great Flood was not primitive challenges more than timelines. It challenges identity. If early humanity inherited sophistication rather than inventing it, then we are not standing at the peak of a steady climb. We are standing somewhere along a long, uneven shoreline where waves have risen and fallen before. This realization carries unease. It removes the comfort of uniqueness. It suggests that intelligence, organization, and understanding do not guarantee permanence, that they may in fact be fragile. The ancient record seems to have known this. Its obsession with cycles is not poetic flourish. It is preparation. Time is not a road but a rhythm. What rises can fall. What falls can rise again, but never in exactly the same form. Modern civilization often resists this rhythm. It frames itself as final, definitive, immune to the kinds of collapse that belong to ancient people. This belief is powerful. It fuels ambition. It accelerates growth, but it also dulls attention. The Sumerians watched the sky, not because they were curious, but because they were cautious. They aligned their cities not to display power, but to remain in harmony. They preserved stories of catastrophe not to terrify, but to remember. Memory for them was not nostalgia. It was infrastructure. What we inherit from that world is not a manual, but a posture, a way of standing in time that assumes interruption rather than continuity, a way of building that assumes loss rather than accumulation. The tragedy of forgetting is not that knowledge disappears. It is that confidence replaces awareness. Systems grow complex yet brittle. Efficiency replaces redundancy. Speed replaces resilience. The ancient world, reduced by catastrophe, chose redundancy. Knowledge was embedded in stone, sky, story, and ritual. If one failed, another remained. This was not inefficiency, it was survival design. Modern systems rarely make this choice. They consolidate, they optimize, they trust continuity. These choices feel rational within a stable horizon. They become dangerous when the horizon shifts. The fragments left by ancient civilizations do not accuse us of ignorance. They remind us of vulnerability. They whisper that forgetting is easier than remembering, and far more costly. The Great Flood, whether singular or symbolic, functions as a boundary in human memory. On one side lies confidence too great to survive. On the other, caution shaped by loss. Civilization, as we know it, emerges on the far side of that boundary. What came before remains indistinct not because it was simple, but because it was interrupted. Its coherence dissolved. Its context vanished. Only what could survive reduction endured. This is why the past feels simultaneously advanced and incomplete. It is not a beginning. It is a remainder. To sit with this idea requires patience. It resists spectacle. It offers no clear villain, no hidden technology, no final revelation. It offers instead a mirror. If humanity has forgotten once, it can forget again. If civilization has reset before, it can reset again. Not because of failure of intelligence, but because of failure of memory. The ancient world seems to have understood that the most important knowledge is not how to build faster, but how to endure longer. Not how to dominate nature, but how to listen to it. Their stories, stripped of context, still repeat this lesson. Floods return. Teachers withdraw. Cycles close. New orders rise atop old foundations. We are living, perhaps, in another moment of confidence, another period of expansion that feels irreversible. The ancient record does not tell us this is wrong. It tells us it is familiar. The question is not whether collapse will come. It is whether memory will survive it. What would we choose to carry forward if forced to reduce ourselves to essentials? What knowledge would still function without power grids, without institutions, without explanations? The Sumerians answered this question through ritual, myth, and alignment. They trusted the sky to remember. They trusted stone to endure. They trusted story to carry what could not be explained. We have different tools. Whether we use them with the same humility remains uncertain. The world before the flood, as glimpsed through fractured evidence, feels less like a lost utopia and more like a warning written in another language, a reminder that advancement without memory is acceleration towards silence. As this journey comes to rest, there is no conclusion to defend, only an image to hold. Humanity standing between cycles, surrounded by systems it trusts. Beneath a sky that has seen far more than it ever says, the past is not gone, it is quiet. And in that quiet, the ancient world seems to ask nothing dramatic. It does not demand belief. It does not insist on revision. It only waits patiently to see whether this time, when the waters rise again, literal or otherwise, we will remember that civilization is not measured by how high it climbs, but by how much it understands what it stands upon. The shoreline remains, the tide recedes and returns, and history, like sleep, carries us gently between forgetting and remembrance, asking only that we listen before the silence grows too complete.